Thank you everyone for joining us for this webinar, Tabula Rasa, an immersive opera in 3 circuits presented by Luther Frank. My name is Laura Lawrence and I'm the Global Marketing Director at Harman. Just a few things before we get started. Everyone on the call is muted to keep down noise levels during the webinar, but there is a chat function where you can submit questions to the presenter and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible at the end. This webinar is also being recorded and the link will be made available a few days after the presentation. We do have a number of other webinars taking place over the next few months for audio, lighting, video, and control, and we'd like to encourage you to take a look at the different webinars in our Learning Sessions workshop series that can be found on pro.harman.com, as well as visiting Harman Professional University to see our many on-demand and certification courses that are all available to you for free. And now I'd like to introduce you to Luther Frank, the presenter for today's webinar. Luther is a lighting designer and scenographer for a variety of industries, including theater, dance, opera, concerts, nightclubs, live events, TV, and more. Operating out of New York City, he works on an average of 100 unique productions a year with an emphasis on lighting, projection, and scenic design. Now I'll pass it over to you, Luther.
Thanks so much, Laura. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. As Laura mentioned, I work primarily as a designer, but I also do a fair amount of programming. I work in a variety of fields, like you said, all kinds, rock, TV, concerts. My website is located there in the opening slide if you'd like to take a look at it just to see all the kinds of work I get up to. But today I wanted to talk about one of the more non-traditional and interesting fields I work in, and that would be immersive theater, or immersive productions in general. Immersive productions have become somewhat of a buzzword in the recent past. I can't tell you how many shows, easily dozens in the past years, that have at least flirted with the idea of going immersive or doing something similar. So I figured we could take a look at this production style, first generally, and then more specifically on one of my more successful immersive designs. Tabula Rasa is an interesting case study. It's easily the smallest show I've designed in New York, at least in terms of equipment. But it was one of the most well-received and positively reviewed, especially for the opera world, which is sort of notoriously critical. Hopefully it will serve as a simple and easy look into what can frequently become a complicated process. I do want to start off by saying this opera is available in its entirety for free online, which is a real treat for opera and especially new works. That doesn't normally happen. This link below is hosted on Vimeo by our composer, Felix Gerard. La Cuarta Productions was the filming company. I believe we have that link in chat for you as well if you'd like to take a look at it. I will say there is some nudity in the show. It contains scenes of artists working with nude photography and painting, so I wanted to give fair warning for that. But there won't be any nudity in this presentation though, so no need to get too excited. So first, as a quick overview, a table of contents, if you will, for the webinar. I'm going to start by going over the theories behind immersive productions, explore some of the reasons why this style is so attractive, and some of the goals of doing shows this way. I'll talk about the unique design concerns that arise when you do away with traditional spaces and support that we're used to, and give you some examples of productions that are doing a really good job of this right now. We'll spend probably the first 15 minutes or so of the session on this topic. I don't want to delve too deeply, just a basic overview. And then we'll take a look at Tabula Rasa specifically. It premiered as a part of OperaFest in 2018, which is a wonderful festival supporting great new works here in New York City. We'll talk about the text, the themes, the concepts behind the piece. Though this won't be a textual analysis course, I mean, that could be its whole other webinar. I mean, they teach entire semesters in college on that sort of thing, so we won't go too deep into the text. But then we'll look at the details of the space, the gear, and how we put this show together in a very raw environment with very little equipment or budget or supplies, and transformed it to our desires. We'll finish off with a review, we'll look at some photos, and then I'll take some questions for you all. So please feel free to get those ready. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's get into the theory. I want to clarify that I'm going to be speaking today about a very specific world, and that is modern Western theater practice. You know, immersive theater has been around forever. Sometimes people talk about it like it's new. It's really not. There's nothing new under the sun. But there are a lot of innovative ideas and new technologies that are being deployed. However, conceptually, these ideas have been around for a great while. I'm also by no means the definitive voice in artistic analysis. There are tons of really smart people writing about this kind of work, and they'd be significantly more eloquent than me. I'm going to be talking about my personal experience creating these works And if you've already been making work in this field for yourself, then there probably won't be too much new information for you here. That said, let's clarify some of the language that I hear thrown around production and concept meetings fairly often here in the States. All of this language should help us answer the big question, which is why go immersive? Quite frankly, if you choose to do a production in an immersive style that doesn't benefit from it, you're going to waste a lot of time and effort and probably do that text a disservice as well. So I want to start off first by pointing out the difference between immersive and site-specific shows, though there can be some overlap. A site-specific show is exactly what it sounds like. The text of the work is directly influenced and enhanced by the space in which it is produced. For instance, there was a very popular production of Sweeney Todd in the UK that was produced inside a meat shop. It was very clever and people loved it. It was a great example of something site-specific, but the text and music of Sweeney Todd was not changed to make the show immersive or interactive in any way. Immersive shows tend to deal with the following ideas more in depth. There is also a difference between immersive production and interactive production. This is best understood through the concept of polychronic narrative, which is a fancy word that basically means that direct interaction from an audience can change the progression of a story, either by call and response or personal touch or any number of ways an audience member can receive the narrative differently. Personal interaction, group interaction, it can change both the timing and movement, but also the structure and the delivery of a show. Now, Tabula Rasa was immersive, but it didn't have too much polychronic narrative. Our story was very much structured and delivered precisely. But other productions that are out there and other ones I've seen have entirely different narratives based on what the audience chooses to do with their bodies every night. And this makes repeat visits highly appealing, and this is why some shows will continue to run for almost decades. Another big feature, and probably the biggest feature of immersive theater, is real space. Now, this is a more abstract idea, ironically, perhaps, but what it refers to is a breakdown of the traditional role of the proscenium theater, or the concert stage, or any traditional setting. When we remove an audience from an expected environment, it can change their perception and reception of ideas. Any show you've seen where the scenic elements reach out into the audience is at least playing with this idea. Immersive shows go one step further by completely forgoing the traditional theater space and placing their narratives in spaces that are real in some way to a text. Whether they are site-specific or generic can vary, but they're usually not theater spaces. Once you have an audience out of their seats, traveling around, observing and interacting with their own will, this introduces a new strength to movement and time, which of course are a part of any production, especially opera, but you end up putting a great deal of this power into the audience's hands. This can change everything about the way the text of a show flows, or even the direction of the events in a story. Finally, while I can't speak too much about this topic personally, virtual reality is being deployed to great effect in immersive productions. I am sadly one of those people who become immediately ill when I attempt to wear a VR headset, though the technology is getting better, and I'm having better response to it. Eventually, they'll probably work that out. I've still seen a lot of concept art and media from some amazing productions that are placing audiences in new realities together and building some worlds for their actors to work in, and the sky really is the limit for this technology. We'll talk about it in a second, but that photo there is an example of a new art installation in New York called Zero Space. Again, we'll talk about it in just a second, but that's a perfect example of a very real space and a non-traditional sense of movement and time. So all that was pretty theoretical. So should you choose to design in this fashion, I want to bring up some of the specific challenges you're going to face. I, of course, faced all of these when dealing with Tabula Rasa and several other shows I've done. First and foremost, your audience is mobile. You're always designing for the human eye, right? Usually at a given perspective. Now that perspective is shifting, moving with the story. Hopefully at predictable and understandable times, but still, it's moving. So when you think about how to light your scene, you need to begin to think about the observer as a moving body in space, the same way you perceive your actors in set pieces. And of course, this moving eye is going to make masking even more difficult. Your audience is naturally curious. That's why they came to see a show. And once you encourage them to explore an environment, this is only going to strengthen their desire to sort of look behind the curtain, right? You need to expect that they will open doors they shouldn't, move boxes and chairs and objects, and generally touch everything, like children. it will and should change how you think about deploying any gear you need to design the show. Timing, of course, becomes a big one. Opera especially is usually run like clockwork by a maestro. When they strike the first measure, you go. But what if your audience isn't keeping pace? What if one audience lingers and the next night it doubles? The speed of a transition, or the speed in which we move from space to space. All productions are going to deal with this in a different way. They're going to have different timing problems and deploy different solutions, but your design needs to account for that fact, that the timing of every moment may change every night. Finally, and probably most importantly, when you choose to do a production in a non-traditional venue, you're going to deal with non-traditional staff. And I don't mean this to be aggressive or mean, but there are rules and expectations I know a lot of us are used to. And to people outside of our industry, these are just completely unknown. This can apply to everything: loading access, setup and strike time requirements, the standard practices for dressing rooms, performers' rights, designer needs, you name it. You've probably been relying on teams of very capable people in the past. I know I have, and suddenly they might be gone. You'll need to think about all the aspects of working in a theater that you take for granted and try to bring those up ahead of time, because if you don't, you'll be working under some severe and unexpected constraints. So having gone over some of those theories, I want to give you some examples of bigger, more famous, wonderful shows out there. These are all very different, yet they're all created in this style. Sleep No More, of course, has been an incredibly successful show. It was produced by Punch Drunk, and it's run at the McKittrick Hotel since 2011. It's probably the most famous immersive theater here in the States. It's an adaptation of Macbeth, but almost all of the spoken dialogue is removed. The story takes place on its own time over 5 different floors of the hotel. The audience is free to move about these spaces and observe the story taking place in whichever environment they please. Obviously, there is a great deal of the show you're not going to see in one visit. Guests are given masks to wear as they observe the show to further immerse them and each other in the scene. It's all very psychological. It's very dark, and you should really see it if you get the opportunity to. They did just open a Sleep No More in Shanghai a few years ago, which I hope to see eventually. Broken Bone Bathtub is much smaller in scale. It's a pop-up show that you can have presented anywhere in the world. It's a wonderful piece of theater that takes place in small bathtubs, maybe even in your home. It's for small, intimate audiences. In this show, the audience actually takes on a role of the protagonist's friends, assisting them in taking a bath in their recently disabled state. It's about trauma and generosity, and it's a really beautiful example of some small immersive theater that's really affected a great number of people around the world. As I mentioned before, Zero Space is a new art immersive experience here in New York. The show is very futuristic. It theoretically transports the audience through a portal into a new reality. This is the concept of the show, and you're exploring it as a part of a government agency, I believe. You dance with projection images of yourself, and you manipulate these spaces. It's very different. There are others like it. I see pictures of Team Lab's Digital Forest on Facebook groups and many, many things like it. There's a very interesting crossover happening right now between the art world and the theater world, especially in terms of lighting and projections that are creating some very interesting and space-altering designs that are worth investigating. But of course, these are all just big, grand ideas. Even if you've never seen these, you've probably been to an escape room or a haunted house. I mean, these concepts and design strategies apply to these small productions as much as they do the large ones. I once had someone argue to me that the most successful immersive production wasn't Sleep No More, and it was the concept of Halloween, which I think was a bit of a stretch. But it is a large festival with millions of participants, and it goes off without a hitch every year. So maybe there was something to that argument. But as you can see, these shows vary in scope and scale, but they all have tackled the same issues. So now let's finally talk about Tabula Rasa, right? I hope that overview was simple and concise enough. Let's start with OperaFest, where it first premiered. I've had the pleasure of putting up a show in OperaFest for the past few years, and if not for the shutdown, I actually would have opened one right as this webinar went live. The festival went digital this year. You can check it out online, but I'm sincerely looking forward to being in some real spaces again with my fellow artists. Every year, over a few months in the spring, about 20 works are produced. It varies every year. And many of them are new explorations and new ideas for the opera world. There are a lot of wonderful composers and great writers. It's really a treat. Most of the productions are not immersive, but there are usually a few, and there are a few site-specific works as well. Opera in an underground crypt, for instance, is a very enchanting way to take in a site-specific opera. All that said, I believe this is the perfect time and place to produce Tabula Rasa. I want to start with that quote, which was from one of our reviews in OperaWire by Logan Martell. Thematically, Tabula Rasa was all about inspiration and possession. It was about exploring the relationship between subject and artist at a time when art was at a fevered peak of visionary force. Logan summed it up really, really well. The opera is set in 1920s Paris. It revolves around the rich artistic scene that evolved there. It follows predominantly the famous photographer Man Ray, who took that photo in the very first slide of this presentation, Violin de Grace, Ingres's violin, or the girl with the violin back, and details his relationship with the muse for that photo, Kiki Montparnasse. Ultimately, the director and librettist, Brittany Goodwin, she wanted to explore several concepts. Who truly creates art? What is it to be human? Excuse me. What is Dada? Where is the cross-section between identity and art, and how can that line be crossed and fouled? When discussing staging, she wanted to go immersive for several reasons. She wanted to put everyone on the same plane of existing, storyteller and audience member, art and audience. Opera has a fairly well-discussed problem with accessibility, high-cost tickets in very old-world venues. She wanted this opera and opera in general to be more accessible and intimate. And I can tell you personally, there is something striking about the high drama of an operatic voice just reverberating through the core of your body, hearing the anguish or joy in a singer mere feet away from you. There's nothing quite like it, and it definitely drew you into Kiki and Nan's state of being, scene by scene. Tabula Rasa, just like Dada and its jazz influences, is passionate. It's chaotic and clumsy and wild. And we knew that being surrounded and immersed in that energy was going to be far more effective than a traditional sit-and-watch theater style. I believe our audience really felt this as well. All the reviews mention the efficacy of the show and the intense quality of the immersion from being in that environment. So it's why I chose to talk about it today, despite its very, very small size. So let's take a look at where we put it up, where we'd be working. The blue building is just this tiny sliver of a building on the east side of Midtown in Manhattan. It's a place where spacious interiors are unheard of. Most new works in the city are incredibly cramped. I really couldn't believe it before I moved here. I grew up in the South, where we just have so much space, and I really couldn't believe it. You know, most theaters in New York are tiny. Empty warehouses like this are usually off in Brooklyn or occupied or prohibitively expensive. Yet here was this space. You walk in those doors and there's this tiny little art gallery, like 10 by 10, 10 by 15 maybe, and a tiny space with a piano. You keep going and then there's this little library and coffee lounge, again, just a little 10 by 15 space maybe, and a private office off to the side. You have to keep going through these small spaces, and then suddenly you're in that picture on the right, this vast empty landscape. It's wild. It's so huge compared to its exterior. It doesn't feel like it could fit in there, and it shocks me to this day when I go in. It's completely undeveloped. Plywood floors, no plumbing, no AC, but you do get some cool air from the other rooms. If you look closely at this photo, you can see that it's just bare Edison bulbs on the ceiling, rigged with exposed cable directly to one of the outlets. There are a few skylights, and that's your work light during the day. But as far as electricity goes, there were just 3 standard American home circuits, the same kind you'd find behind me in my room here and probably in your home as well. And that's all I had to design this lighting rig with in all this square footage. There was no technical manager, no house manager, no TD, no master electrician. Forget it, none of those traditional support roles. There was a building super and a building owner. And they were very nice people, and they did donate this space for free, or I believe at very minimal cost, to the production. So the expectation really falls away from the house to provide much after that. And this is a new work, and we had a space, and a big, beautiful space by regular standards. So this was going to be a story about making it work. This was going to be Tabula Rasa, an opera in 3 circuits. So after digesting and understanding the text and having concept meeting after concept meeting and truly digging into the music, the director and I visited our space and walked through it the way our audience would. We talked about where each scene was going to be placed and what kind of sets our scenic designer, Maria Torfield, would deploy. And it was time to figure out how to light it. There aren't too many locations, so I'm just going to go through them quickly and tell you my initial thoughts and show you what we made of them. So first on the left there is our jockey. This is where Kiki Montparnasse performed. It's a jazz venue. Think drinking, smoking, enjoying the Gilded Age, you know, in Paris, France. It's loud, it's bustling and fun and deviant. This was the easiest and most presentational areas for my design. The audience was fairly well regulated to a straight-on view, and I knew I needed a spotlight for Kiki, one circuit down, right? And some way to tell the story of this space in light. Second, in the middle, and the third picture as well on the right, is what I refer to as Man Ray Square, though that isn't textually accurate. The space just sits in the middle of our venue, and there's these wrought iron I-beam squares above them. Steel, not wrought iron, sorry. This space sits in the middle of the entire venue, and the production revolves around it. We begin and end the show here. We return here several times throughout the show. It's a through line. And mainly it's used for scenes in photography and drawing studios, Man Ray's most importantly. It's where we show the famous Girl with Violin Back being taken. I call it Man Ray Square. And I would probably spend a majority of my time up on those iron beams running cables and getting lights where they needed to go. That's where the majority of my rig would end up. Because the audience would view this space from all angles, I knew I needed coverage from many different places. And I still needed to tell stories in those spaces with time and space and color. So Man Ray's studio, for instance, needed to look different from Artist Alley or meetings in the street. So this was a very challenging space. So going further into our space from that point, you can see a large dividing brick wall and a large and small opening in that wall. On the left where the piano is in that photo, we would use that for one of our two restaurants and a brief jail scene, and the other corner for a different restaurant scene. These were outdoor and daytime scenes. They're less intimate than the rest of the work, except for maybe the jail moment, which was fairly quick. So they served as excellent palette cleansers. The jockey and the red room, which we're going to look, these were incredibly vibrant scenes. And this space occupied a perfect balancing point, and we could give the show some bright white light for some bright, funny arias. And the brick, even though it's old and distressed, was still incredibly warm and vibrant when it reflected a strong incandescent source of light. So we go through this large opening into that center photo of Man Ray's bedroom. It's a tight space with a 180-degree viewing angle. And unlike the other space, there was no overhead rigging. The ceiling gets much lower in here, and the audience is in much closer proximity. So I had to tuck lights in strange corners and around weird pipes. And I had to use some traditional lamps for support, like a bedside table lamp. And it was pretty effective because the audience was in that close proximity anyway. I mean, some of the most intimate moments in the show happen here, quite literally, and it's fairly uncomfortable to be in someone's bedroom for those scenes, which is one of the beauties of the immersive style, right? So through those archways, we come to our final area, which was Man Ray's film development room, or the red room. And textually speaking, this room only called for red light. It's a concept room as well as a technical room. So this room was where we go to be bathed in this light and to really understand the driving thoughts behind this artist's mind. In some ways, it's a little smaller than the bedroom. Only Man Ray and a cellist were able to perform here at center while the audience encircled them. He speaks and sings directly to the audience in this room. That's very chilling. It's a very powerful moment. So I knew it needed to feel that dramatic. So now that we've analyzed the space, let's take a look at the gear. Are you jealous? That's not everything, but it all looked like that. A great many of my colleagues were jealous when they saw photos of the space. Again, there's not a lot of room here in the city. But when I showed them the gear, they just put their hands up in defeat. I mean, my budget for this show, as with a lot of new work, was zero. If I can offer any advice to young designers, it's to make friends, as many as possible. I work on a lot of shows, and most of them have amazing inventories, shows with hundreds of moving lights, or the newest and best LED and video gear, plenty of great Martin products. And all those friends on those shows are the ones who you can call in favors when you have nothing to work with. So I came up with a wish list, right? I designed bare bones. I revised that wish list. I looked at my power issues again and again, and I revised it. And I started asking around. And eventually, I had a few people come to my aid and really help me put this production together. Frost Productions came through and donated some game-changing gear. They let me borrow 2 wireless DMX dimmer packs. They were a bit old. They could have some trouble, some operations sometimes, but they worked. And they weren't going out of the rental shop too much at the moment, so they let me borrow them. These packs obviously don't give you additional power, but each one will split your power from 2 circuits into 6 dimmable channels. Now, since I only had 3 circuits, one of them had to remain available for house, the 4th circuit. So I could only use half of one of the packs. So I ended up turning my 3 circuits into 9 dimmable channels of power. Now we're cooking with grease, right? They also donated the long runs of cable that I would need to get from space to space, and a few pipes and bases that I could tuck into corners where I didn't have overhead rigging. Now, in the space, there was only 2 Lecos in inventory. That was it. Mike Wood, a lighting design friend of mine, who, as of right now, is running a musical programming competition on his website. It's been making the rounds on social media, but if you weren't aware of that, I would check it out. Mike Wood, LD. He was teaching at a high school in Manhattan, and they had just upgraded their theater with all new LED equipment. So he was giving away, shipping pallets full of Fresnels. And I've noticed this across the country, that a lot of people have incandescent stock that they just don't use anymore and are looking to get rid of, either on the cheap or for giveaway. It seems like every other day there's a post in a social media group about people tossing out old par cans. So keep your ear to the ground for that kind of stuff. It can be remarkably useful when you have nothing else. So I took a full pallet. I knew I couldn't power them all, but I also didn't have a budget for lamps. So I took more than I needed in case they burnt out during the run, or, you know, if one of them blew some internal component. I just didn't have time, and I just replaced the light itself. There were also some clip lights and string lights found in the corners of the space. And our scenic designer, Maria, created these beautiful Dada sculptures, and we placed them around that center square. I'll see a photo of this later. And I was able to use string lights and clip lights to create one large circuit and use it just as a reflecting point. And we reflected off of all this wood and bronze and really filled the space for house lighting. It was remarkably effective. And then finally, in what I think is the most non-traditional gear I deployed, was for control. It was just DMX-Cat. DMX-Cat is just a channel tester, and it was my own personal copy, and it was running on an Amazon Fire tablet. So that was my answer for control. I only needed one 50-foot DMX cable to connect the 2 packs, and then I plugged DMX-Cat into the first one. And I trained an operator to sit there and run our show off manual control. I mean, obviously there were limitations. I couldn't have any timed cues. I didn't have any record function. But, you know, theater lighting had been done manually for half a century before computers, so I tried not to let it bother me. And in practice, this ended up being perfect. We trained this operator who became a really integral member of the production, and they would sit in the audience and they would follow with them from scene to scene and light each scene in time with whatever pace the audience and performers managed to achieve that night. And they knew where the lights would go, obviously. I mean, I had the scenes all programmed on paper, and they learned to feel the pace. Every transition was different, but they made it look perfect every time. And, you know, even if I did have some console in another room with wireless cameras, some sort of perfect solution, they still would have had to run the cues manually. I mean, when you're dealing with the timing issues that this kind of production takes. So I was very happy with this unconventional gear. So I put it all up myself. You know, I didn't have a crew really, and I programmed the scenes in tech, pencil paper, and I trained my operator, and we opened. So here I'll show you those same areas we just looked at and talk about the lights I used and why. And then we'll look at some larger production stills, and that'll be it. So on the left, there's our jockey again. You can see the audience in the back there. I stuck with that single spotlight for Kiki and her singers. I chose one broad stroke of color from a low side, creating a nice solid shadow on the wall there. That's real quality incandescent light that's a little hard to replicate in modern LEDs. It gave the space a sense of grandeur and scope, made it feel larger, and it kept that deviant and unusual feel to it. There was also one blue light up on the beams next to the spotlight, casting down over the audience and the singers, filling the rest of the scene in with that jazzy atmosphere. In the center, you can see Man Ray Square. The middle picture is literally our opening look. Those are all the performers, minor characters mostly, painting, working in their studios. The audience was free to move about the space, enjoy the art, drink, and socialize. I've mixed a series of warm and cool colored Fresnels in each square, mixing to soft white for each model. Our scenic designer's art is on the back wall there, that brick wall on both. You can't see the other one. But you can see what I was talking about, the luminosity, the amount of reflectivity they gave off was perfect house lighting. It made a huge difference when that light went out. It was more effective at starting a show than a lot of house lighting I've seen. Very immersive way to start a show. On the right, you can see our orchestra. You won't see them in most shots. You have to realize they needed to move with the production as well. It was quite amazing to watch them work. I mean, they even moved the piano. Some would play while others would move, and the space was never silent. Music was always echoing off the brick in other rooms, yet they were always where they needed to be for the next scene. It was marvelous staging. In that second photo, we're still in Man Ray Square, just in a more intimate scenic environment. He is about to paint the violin back in the scene. For that scene, our violinist actually came out from the orchestra and sat back to back with Kiki, and that's another example of how you can create poignant moments in this immersive style of theater. This scene shows two Fresnels colored in a bright, warm sunlight for Kiki as though through a studio window. And just off camera, you can see it there, is Man Ray's camera backlit in a cool white bounce, contrasting the power of Kiki's body, you know, the source of the art, and the troubled creator. Even with two lights, you can tell a pretty deep story. We move now to our restaurant. As I said before, these are fun moments in an otherwise heavy piece, so they are bright by comparison. The other restaurant, which was texturally outside, was even brighter than this. They're very simple and quick scenes, and what you're looking at is just one light. There were two lights for the other restaurant, but it had to be mixed in for jail duty as well, so that scene was a little bit more complicated, harder to film because of proximity. But you can see here it's very simple, it's very warm, it's very lively. In the center, just beyond that wall, is Kiki, Man Ray's bedroom, and we see here Kiki frustratingly leaving. You'll notice most of these shots you can see the audience on the other side. When working in the style, you never forget that you're an interloper or a voyeur into these scenes. You and the rest of the audience are in someone else's bedroom, and it's a different feeling to be there than when you see it on stage. At one point in the script, Kiki's mother actually comes out from the audience and sits on the bed, delivering a damning aria of shame as Kiki sleeps. She's not in the other scenes, and it's always a bit unexpected. It's a perfect example of what you can do with this style. Just through that archway, and you're in the Red Room, Man Ray's film development studio. This is our preview audience. So the real audience was about twice that size. It could get pretty cramped in there. Still, Man Ray and that cellist sold that room every night. I loved it. He literally bathed in his ideas and his psyche. That red light just permeates everything. There's no other source of light in that space. So this is just two cross-shot Fresnels from the corners behind the archway. Very simple design, but a very dramatic change of scenery to walk in and out of. So that's it. We opened. Those were the specifics. I've got a few more photos here to show you, and then we'll just talk about the big picture, so to speak. This is that same house opening shot from earlier. You can see the details I was talking about, the paintings, the orchestra. You can also see my Fresnels just poking out from the I-beams, which was really neat. They were all nested in there quite nice. It's a very full and busy space to enter into, but this is also a great comparison to this next photo, which is halfway through the opera. We're back in that exact same space, but without all that clutter, you can see just how vast and expansive the area could become. Even the orchestra has cleared away here. Still playing just further off, of course, but this is just 3 circuits of power. I should say 3 dimmable channels of power, honestly. A glorious warm light for Kiki, and then 2 Man Ray squares in cold light for Man Ray to enter and exit in. I just love how the space could change from one to the other. I will say something interesting. In preparing for this presentation, my director actually sent me a set of notes on the scene change movement. It can get pretty hectic, but I thought you might find it interesting considering these 2 different shots. So check this out. These are the movement directions for how we got here. Move 24, Intermezzo Noir at Blanche. We travel to the modeling area where we recreate the photos. Dada dudes, can we bring back the doors and alleys so that you are all set up during the Wine Mom song? Ready for SL and Frank. During the modeling part, everyone's staring at Kiki. Kiki, this aids your paranoia. On those last lines, everyone start to drift back how you did during alleys and doors. Man, when you leave, go to your studio. Make sure you get there too. Walter, Jeff, girls, go to the restaurant area. Walter, be on deck to be the mailman. Now, I know that was a lot of terminology that might not make sense to you, but hopefully it gives you an idea of the moving parts. behind each one of these scenes, and so that even if the audience were directed one way, your actors are already preparing another scene in another darkened area. And of course, the lighting operator is there helping to direct space as well, but making sure people have work light in the spaces that aren't actively used so that they can get the next scene set up. Here's a closer look at the red room. You can see all the details. There was a skylight in here that had to be blacked out, of course. I'm fairly certain this room used to be a garden, who knows how long ago, but, but now it's encased in all the buildings around it. The architecture is really confusing in this space. Still, this is a very good example of a real space to be in. You felt like you were in this red room, this conceptual space for Man Ray, and not really in a presentational theater. We're back in the bedroom. You can see my light tucked up there high in between some water pipes. The red room is still spilling in from beyond. The camera's a little overexposed in this, but you can see how it was done. The fill light coming from off stage from that table lamp, 2 lights, very, very simple. And then a couple more shots of our jockey, just for scale and color. This one without an audience during a rehearsal, but from their perspective, so you can see how the shadow play worked. And then this final shot from the corner again. The scene was actually about to end. You'll notice Kiki is just about to leave and head towards that white light. As she would leave, obviously, the audience would make way and this scene would be ready for them. It was blacked out just a moment earlier. And so it's this wonderful dichotomy of like, oh, I was just there, and it was different. You can also see a little bit behind the curtain here. That stage is clearly just balanced on egg crates. I mean, that's making low budget new work theater, right? Thankfully, the audience was never going to be on the side, so we didn't have to mask the entirety of that stage. But you can see what we were working with. So I hope you enjoyed looking at that. This last image is that mailman that was on deck, by the way. Again, it's one of my smallest shows, but there was just something about the purity of light and concept. And when working in this style, you can just get back to these basic principles of an aesthetic. And I really enjoyed it. So again, I want to point out that Vimeo link if you want to see the whole opera in its entirety. And I'm here and ready if any of you have any questions. I saw a hand was raised earlier.
All right, we do have some questions. The first one is asking, how did you work around the skylights? Did you cover them or only do your programming and focus at night? And how much ambient light came in during the show?
So we did have a very late show time, and it was at a good time of day in New York, so we didn't have a lot of interference with audiences. I mean, by the time the audiences entered in, the sun was already down. And by the time you hit the red room, it was maybe 9 or 10 o'clock, and so it was true darkness outside. So we didn't have to worry about it during the show. Programming, of course, yeah, it meant that I pretty much had to wait until 10 o'clock to do programming notes. But if you remember, I was putting it up all myself anyway, and I was doing other shows at the same time. I overwork myself, so I would spend all day doing physical labor, you know, whether it's repairing lamps or running cable or whatever, and we'd get through rehearsal, and then my director was wonderful to work with, and she would always say, oh, you need to see this scene? Let's make sure we have time in darkness to see that scene. And we would go there and do that scene out of order if we needed to. So that's a good point, though. You do need to communicate those needs to your creative staff, because if they're not aware that they need to look at things in dark at certain times, then they won't be ready to do so. So that's definitely an example of early communication on what your needs are going to be. It's an unexpected need. You're absolutely right.
Okay, the next question is asking, with only 3 circuits, did you plug your DMX cat into power or just run it from its battery during the show?
Oh, battery, yeah. So it was run on battery because I didn't have a circuit, right? So part of the checklist every night was obviously making sure it was plugged in overnight, along with the Amazon tablet. I mean, we're literally removing our show circuits so that we can plug in our control circuits overnight, and then unplugging our control circuits and putting in our show circuits. I mean, when I think back on it, it's kind of crazy, right? But good on you for noticing. I'd actually forgotten we had done that. But it is kind of remarkable. Yeah, battery operated.
All right, next question is asking, you explained where the gear came from, but what about your gel? Where and how did you source that?
Under my desk. I'm not even kidding you. I've collected some gel over the past, and I think it's smart if you're going to design new works to have access to a little bit of gel, especially whites, you know, your cool whites, your off warms, your bastard ambers, these sort of things. It's nice just to have them. again, if you're working with LEDs and moving lights and stuff all day, you don't really need them. And so I forget about them, but I keep a roll of my favorite gels in my desk. It's also pretty great because I have lamps around the house and I can take a look at costumes or art if somebody comes over and be like, this is the light I want to achieve. And I don't have to use like a tiny little swatch book, which I also have. But yeah, it's all my personal stock of gel. And again, we're talking about 9 dimmable channels. The total Fresnel count was 12, right? So it wasn't like you needed a huge chest. It was just a personal collection.
All right, next question is asking, how much pre-production and rehearsal time did you have in the space?
Now we had, it's hard to answer that accurately because the production had a great deal of time in the space, which I'm very thankful for, more than a lot of people would in a traditional theater. I didn't have a lot of time because I was brought in fairly late in the production and I was already booked in tech on other projects. So I had a couple rehearsals that I was able to see first and a couple meetings that I was able to go to first. But thankfully, I had digital copies of, you know, script and music and all that sort of stuff. But it's a fast-paced environment. So, I mean, you're probably looking at, I want to say 4 or 5 days of my work in this space. The performers themselves got to practice their movement and rehearse and sing in the environment for a couple of weeks, which is really great for new work to have more than a week in a space. But I had about 4 days.
All right, next question is asking, did your color palette come from the story with adjustment to the environment, or did the environment lead?
It's both. It's definitely both. I have a sort of internal color palette I think a lot of us designers do that we instinctually go to. But one of the beauties of immersive theater is digesting that real space. And once you go into a space, you've got to be open to that influence, right? And you go into that space with your scenic designer, of course, too, and say, Maria, how are we going to change this? And for instance, the kind of color that I put on Maria's artwork was entirely influenced by the wood and the brass and the bottles and everything that she was putting out there. I knew that cool white was out of the question. This needed some warm reflectivity. And the jockey was just such a naturally dark atmosphere, and to me wanted that saturated color. But this last photo we're looking at here is sort of my internal understanding of white light. So it's definitely both. I think you have to be open to that real space and to go where that room wants you to go. But you know, your gut is probably smarter than you think it is.
Okay, it looks like that's it that came in for questions. Luther, thank you so much for the presentation. This was really interesting. I love the concept of immersive spaces, and I'm hoping that this will be open for me to come and visit in New York.
Like I said, I was about to do another show in this space, actually, for this OperaFest, but we closed down. So I think it'll still be there next time you're here.
Wonderful. I'm going to share a couple of links in the chat window before everybody leaves. If you missed it, the link is available to the full presentation of Tabula Rasa. And then I'm sharing a few others because we always get asked. The first one is the link to our Harman Professional Training site. So you can get on there, get access to all of our free curriculum. The second link is to our YouTube playlist, and that's where we put all of the recorded sessions, which this one will also be added to it. And the third link is to our events calendar for all upcoming webinars. And just so you know, Luther does have 2 additional sessions that are coming up in June. So if you'd like to register for those, please go out there. We'd love to have you again. Thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thanks again, Luther.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Pleasure.
Great job, Luther. Good seeing you. Thank you.
Thanks, man. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thanks, Luther. Bye, everyone.
Wonderful.